Right. So we will wrap up our discussion of post-war and post-colonial literature and round out our tour of the African continent. We started in the south, we went northeast, kind of dipped back down central, or went northwest, but dipped back down central, now we're northeast and Egypt with Nahib Mahfouz, probably the most important Egyptian writer of the 20th century, as Achebe is the most important Nigerian writer of the 20th century. And just like the other three writers we've looked at, Mahfouz chronicled the events that plagued his country through the process of decolonization and brought those events to a public global light through his impactful writing. So let's take a look at his background and context. He was the first Arabic writer to win the Nobel Prize, and he traced the roots of his work to the ancient Egyptians. So, in mentioning the ancient Egyptians, I want to say something that will guide our whole discussion of Mahfouz. He is known for combining realism and mysticism in his works, and I think you see that very clearly in Zabalawi when it's a very realist type of story. Everything that happens there is a very kind of realist context that could all actually happen. But he's searching for this saint, this healer, this very mystical presence. And so I think you really see the fusion of those two elements in this story. And so keep that in the back of your mind. We're going to use that as our main thread as we go through his background, through the context of post-colonial Egypt, and through the story itself till we arrive at our thesis at the end here. And so, like I said a minute ago, most scholars agree that without Mahfouz, the turbulent history of 20th century Egypt would never be known. He, like Rhodesia or Zimbabwe, like Algeria, like Nigeria, Egypt had, a bloody end to colonization, and Mahfouz is really the writer that brought those things into an international light, that through the popular worldwide success of his novels showed to the rest of the world what was happening in Egypt throughout the 20th century. And part of that was that he lived nearly a century. He lived to be a ripe old age of 94, born in 1911, died in 2006. I think I have those dates right. Anyway, math is not my strong suit, but he lived to be 94, so he saw almost an entire century. He came just about 6 years short of seeing an entire century's worth of events. So he literally watched the transition from colonial to post-colonial for Egypt. So what was some of that context, that post-colonial context? Let's go through that the way we went through the Algerian and the Nigerian context and history as well. So you've probably heard of the Ottoman Empire. Egypt was under Ottoman rule for a long time, then occupied by the British starting in 1883. At the start of World War I, Egypt was declared a British protectorate in 1914, which, that word protectorate sounds positive, like this country is under this other country's protection as the world erupts in war. But it really was just a way of saying this is still a British colony during the war. There was a violent uprising against British rule in 1919, so the Egyptians fought back. And they negotiated a few years later in 1923 a constitutional monarchy, which is essentially what you have in England, where you have a monarch, but you also have like a constitutional government, kind of a fusion of a monarchy and the more like democratic government we have here in the U.S. So what they established in 1923 was still very much, under British rule. It was a government similar to what they have in England. And so at this point, Mahfouz is witnessing these things. He's getting a little bit older. He starts writing. And so what did he write? He wrote novels. Novel was not part of traditional Arabic writing, even though traditional Arabic writing has all kinds of literary forms. The novel is not one of those literary forms. So Mahfuz, much like Achebe, took the tool of the colonizer, right? The novel was the most popular literary form in Britain in the 19th century at the height of imperialism. And there are all kinds of imperialist texts, like, for instance, say King Solomon's Mines, that perpetuate the stereotypes about people from Nigeria and Egypt and other places. So rather than writing in traditional Arabic forms, he wrote novels. Again, using the tool of the colonizer to write back. His first really successful novels were the Cairo trilogy, a trilogy of novels he wrote, I believe, in the 1950s. And those were very realist texts. And then kind of the next thing he wrote after that in the 1960s was a more mystical novel called The Child of Gerbalawi, or The Children of Gerbalawi. So he integrated different styles as he went. But what we see with the transition from the Cairo trilogy, which most people consider his crowning achievement, to later on The Children of Gerbalawi, is the realism and the mystical, the combination of those two things that we see in this story, Zabalawi. A little more context. So after the success of the Cairo novels, actually in 1952, the year he published the final novel in the trilogy, an officers' coup headed by a man named Nasser overthrew the monarchy and instituted a republic. This initially seemed good, but because a republic, right, more democratic, promised democratic reforms. Mahfuz initially supported this, but then he, like everyone else, saw that these democratic reforms did not hold up. They didn't happen as promised, and this new form of government was also problematic. And so, like I said, just like all the other countries looked at, a very complicated history in the 20th century. And Mahfuz was openly critical of the new government once it did not follow through on its democratic promises. So even though he was famous worldwide, his books are banned in many Arab countries, and he's even been attacked by Islamic groups. In fact, in 1994, when he was in his early 80s, he was stabbed in the neck by an assailant. Fortunately, he recovered from this attack, but he eventually lost his sight and became very reclusive in his old age and died in Cairo at the age of 94. So here you have this man who saw a whole history of British rule, violent uprising, monarchy, more violent uprising, the failure of democratic reforms. And he takes all of this, lets it influence his writing, fuses his writing with a combination of realism and mysticism, and produces writing that shows to the rest of the world what was happening in Egypt in the 20th century. And so this is a writer who I think we have a fascinating story with Zabalawi, and I would love, when I have time, to read the Cairo trilogy, to read The Children of Gerbalawi, to read more of his works. But right now, let's turn to Zabalawi and see what we have in this fascinating little story. So, like I said, let's keep in mind the combination of realism and mysticism throughout. It's essentially a realist tale. Even though we have a first-person narrator, and that narrator clearly has some struggles, the presentation of events seems fairly objective. It feels like a fairly 19th century type of narrator for the most part, even though he's consumed by this search for Zabalawi. But at the same time, what he's searching for is this mystical thing. So we'll keep that in mind. And then one other thread to keep in mind is the progression of the narrative. It follows a very clear pattern where he finds someone who knows Zabalawi. That person kind of gives him some clues, and each time he gets a little bit closer. And so there's a pattern and a progression. Same thing. Meet someone, misses Zabalawi, but gets closer. So a pattern and a progression. But then he never finds him, right? It doesn't end with him and Zabalawi meeting up. He never finds Zabalawi. But the last word of the story is, I must find Zabalawi. So it fuses mysticism and realism. There's a pattern and a progression, but the goal is never obtained. So it's a story about searching. And really, I think as you'll see here as we go through the threads, a story about a soul who is never at rest. We'll talk about the implications of that and what it means. But let's trace the events of the narrative. So when he's a young boy, he hears about Zabalawi from his father. When he gets old, he has these ailments. He's sick, and no medical cure. No doctors can cure this thing. That's another kind of mystical thing. There's never an explanation of that, but we as the reader are told repeatedly by the narrator to assume that he's explored every other option aside from the mystical healing of Zabalawi. So that's kind of that fusion there, right? We're presented this information that seems very realistic, but kind of just have to suspend our disbelief. We have to hold that view because we're not given an alternative one. And he reiterates that to most of the people he meets. And so we begin this journey. And the first person he meets with is an old friend of his father's who's like a lawyer, basically a bureaucrat. And one thing I noticed during this conversation that's really interesting is the narrator is ill at ease. He's uncomfortable in his own skin. So when he meets this man, he sees the look of warm welcome he gave me left no doubt in my mind that he thought me a prospective client, and I felt acutely embarrassed at encroaching upon his valuable time. So we all know that feeling when we go in to someone and they could potentially sell us something and they're incredibly nice. And he's not there to buy anything, right? He's not a prospective client. So, immediately he knows the guy is going to be deflated, and he can sense that perceptively ahead of time. And so he already feels embarrassed and awkward. And so, a more confident person would just go in and assume, I'm just going to ask this guy this thing. It's not going to take him very long. It's not a big deal that he's not making any money off me. But instead, our narrator is ill at ease, uncomfortable in his own skin. That's important because it's a story about searching. It's a story about a person who's not at rest. And so this is kind of further evidence to show us this guy is not at rest. So let's move along. Like I said, there's a pattern and a progression. So he meets with someone, doesn't get what he's looking for, moves to the next person. That's the pattern. The progression is each person is a little bit closer. So the next important interaction is with the musician. And the musician is closer than the bureaucrat, who we just looked at, to Zabalawi. In other words, he's seen him more recently, has a better idea of where he might be. The character, the narrator, essentially through each of these meetings is getting closer and closer to Zabalawi. Like he's inching closer, but he never gets there. That's kind of the frustrating part, the tease. And one thing I noticed is as the individuals are closer to Zabalawi, the narrator feels a little more at ease being around them. For instance, he's incredibly comfortable with the musician. So that's a really important scene. Let's take a look at it. I immediately greeted him and introduced myself and was put at ease by the unaffected way in which he received me. He did not ask, either in words or gesture, what had brought me, and I did not feel that he even harbored any such curiosity. So if we juxtapose these two scenes, something really interesting emerges, and that's the narrator's perception of what the other person wants in these two interactions. In the first interaction, he feels, in his words, embarrassed because he's encroaching upon the person's time. Another reason, and he's also like seeing, he thought me a prospective client. So he's kind of making an assumption about this guy wanting to know why he's there. But with the other interaction, he's put at ease. So that's different. And what puts him at ease? That's the interesting part, is what puts him at ease. He did not ask, either in words or gesture, what had brought me, and I did not feel that he even harbored any such curiosity. So what puts him at ease is that this guy doesn't want anything from him. He's just happy to have him there. And what you'll notice about this guy, this musician, is he's very at ease himself. He's kind of this like chilled out dude, right? Like I imagine like a musician from the 1960s maybe, or like the dude from the Big Lebowski. Just this guy who's completely at peace, completely at ease, vibing on his music. But why is that important? Well, it's important because the narrator is not at ease, but he's around someone else who's at ease, and so that puts him at ease. And so you have a character who's contented and restful, and another character who cannot find contentment or rest. And that's really important, that juxtaposition, because it shows that being resting or being at ease is possible, but for some reason it's not possible for our narrator. And what emerges from this scene, we're going to look at it in a little bit more detail here, are two really interesting things. One is that, as I've said before, the narrator is constantly searching. I mean, as he's searching for Zabalawi, do you get like a reminder of Faust, right? Just constantly searching, never at rest. And so we have probably the most important line of the story actually in this conversation. When he asks the musician about Zabalawi, he says, and the musician says, lots of people need Zabalawi. The narrator then asks, do those who need him suffer as I do? And here's the important line. The musician says, such suffering, as in your suffering, is part of the cure. Take a minute, think about that. Such suffering is part of the cure. So we have to ask, what is really afflicting this guy? It's presented in a realist context, right? It's a medical thing, no doctor can cure, so he needs mystic help. That's a fairly realist context. But is it really a medical thing, or is it something going on, let's say, in his heart, in his soul? He's not at peace. He's not at rest. So the cure, what would be the cure for that then? If it's not a medical thing, if it's his soul that's not at rest, what is the cure? Well, this musician who seems to be at rest, who seems to be contented and at peace, says, such suffering is part of the cure. So perhaps suffering is inevitable. Perhaps we can't avoid suffering. And if we think we can or we try to, we'll only end up suffering more. If we try to negate suffering, we'll end up looking for Zabalawi. And what this story tells us is that we'll never find Zabalawi. So I said two really important things came out of this interaction with the musician. One is such suffering is part of the cure. If we can't accept suffering, we'll only ever be looking for Zabalawi and we'll never find him. Number two is what I say up above that. He cannot find enough rest to even appreciate things. So when the musician reveals that, Zabalawi's not there, the narrator says, so my visit has been in vain? And this bothers the musician. The musician smiles. He's bothered, but he's still smiling because he's at peace. He's at rest. So he smiled, laying his cheek against the side of the lute. God forgive you, he said, for saying such a thing of a visit that has caused me to know you and you me. So he's this groovy dude, right? Like the dude. He's excited just to have gotten to know this kind of nervous, kind of obnoxious narrator. I mean, he's probably not the kind of person you and I would like to hang out with. But this musician's probably a much more laid-back, kinder person than you or me. And by that, I mean the average person when I say you or me. And so he's all chilled out, and he's just glad to have met another human soul, that human connection. But the narrator can't even take the time to appreciate that human connection. I think about our lives in the 21st century when I read this passage, and we are so busy. Our lives are so full. And that may not be suffering in the sense of suffering in a post colonial community, but it's certainly a condition of being a modern human person. And we have to stop and smell the roses. I mean, this story is saying some fairly simple things that should be straightforward, but I think they're really important things that we've forgotten, and Matthews is telling them to us. All right, let's look at a couple more of the interactions. So, does he find rest? I apologize. Please don't be distracted by the quote. I wanted to say something before this quote, and I must have made a mistake and not set it to fly in. But he goes along on his journey some more, and then he meets a guy who is basically an alcoholic, and the guy will only give him information about Zabalawi if the narrator will drink with him to the point of drunkenness, which I think because of like medical reasons, the narrator doesn't drink. But he's so obsessed with finding Zabalawis that he does. And so eventually he passes out and has this dream. And I've been saying over and over again, he's not at ease. He can't find rest. But he finds it in one moment in this dream. So in addition to the line that the suffering is part of the cure, which is the most important line of the story, this is the most important full, lengthier passage. And the italicized part is the most important part, so I'm going to read that. I dreamed that I was in an immense garden, surrounded on all sides by luxuriant trees, and the sky was nothing but stars seen between the entwined branches, all unfolded in an atmosphere like that of sunset or a sky overcast with cloud. I was lying on a small hammock of jasmine petals, more of which fell upon me like rain, while the lucent spray of a fountain unceasingly sprinkled the crown of my head and my temples. I was in a state of deep contentedness, of ecstatic serenity. An orchestra of warbling and cooing played in my ear. Here it is. There was an extraordinary sense of harmony between me and my inner self, and between the two of us in the world, everything being in its rightful place, without discord or distortion. In the whole world there was no single reason for speech or movement, for the universe moved in a rapture of ecstasy. This lasted but a short while. When I opened my eyes, consciousness struck at me like a policeman's fist. That doesn't sound pleasant, waking up from that dream. So this is incredibly important, right? If the suffering is part of the cure, what's the disease? Well, here, I think we have the cure. An extraordinary sense of harmony between me and my inner self, and between the two of us and the world, everything being in its rightful place without discord or distortion. What is that? How do we achieve that? Well, I think we see a couple of things here. One, the disease is that he is not in harmony with his inner self, his soul, let's call it that. And he and his inner self are also not in harmony with the world, except for in this moment. That sounds like a very kind of existential, abstract thing, but it's really simple. You have the suffering of the modern human person. That's going to cause anybody anxiety, and this is an extreme example of it. An incredibly anxious man. I think he owes something to the underground man here. And so, what do you do with that? You have to find harmony somehow. How do you reconcile these things? How do you live without discord or distortion? The modern human condition is one of discord and distortion. Well, the suffering is part of the cure. I think you have to accept that suffering is inevitable and find a way to live with it. You know, I think of with this character someone who has like a severe stomach pain, something they're just hurting, and they can't get that hurt to stop, and they just need that hurt to stop. But the reality is their own anxiety, rather than some kind of medical thing, is what's causing that extreme hurt, and they have to let go of that anxiety in order for the hurt to stop. It's an incredibly complex, challenging condition, but I think it's one from which many of us suffer. I certainly know of times when things worry me, things make me anxious, that they're not things about which I need to be anxious. Okay. Gosh, I'm really sorry. Something went wrong with these bullet points are supposed to be flying in one at a time. So after he wakes from this dream, the dream where he's finally at rest, some other really, interesting things happen as we have the last few paragraphs of the story. So let's take a look at those and then arrive at our thesis to wrap up the lecture. So first there's irony, right? Because while he's asleep, Zabalawi is there. That's like the ultimate stinger, right? Like this whole thing has been a pattern and progression of being let down over and over again, but each time getting a little bit closer. And then the guy is supposedly physically present there while our narrator is asleep. What a pity. He was sitting on this chair beside you the whole time. He was playing with a string of jasmine petals he had around his neck, a gift from one of his admirers. Then, taking pity on you, he began to sprinkle some water on your head to bring you around. So the things we saw in the dream that set the context for his soul and himself and the world being at peace, jasmine petals, the water being sprinkled on him, that was supposedly Zabalawi there doing that while the narrator was asleep. So he's actually with Zabalawi. He's finally found him when he's at rest. But it doesn't last. It's a fleeting dream. And so I think that tells us what is Zabalawi, right? We've been asking this whole time. It's a saint, a healer, a mystic, something, but it's always presented as a real person, like a guy, a saint or a healer or whatever, but a guy you could physically find. But he never finds him, right? People have supposedly seen him, but I think we're supposed to be much more skeptical. I think this is, less of a realist text the further we dig into it. I think we're supposed to be skeptical of the narrator and maybe even the people he talks to. I think it could all be an allegory. Matthews was known for writing an allegory. An allegory is where you have something that's presented is one thing, but to really show another. Some of the most famous examples of allegory are George Orwell's Animal Farm, where the animals represent different figures from the Russian Revolution, or C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, which is, an allegory for the Christian gospel, where the lion represents Jesus. And so, I think this could be an allegory. I think the narrator is the modern human person and who's not at peace or at rest. And Zabalawi is the cure for that, which isn't a person. It's a state of being. It's a state of being where yourself, your soul, and the world are in harmony, at peace with each other. And so I think Matthews uses irony and allegory to teach us that. And so what's really at stake here is peace between oneself, and the larger world. He's hoping Zabalawi will come back the next night. And so he says, I am willing to give him any money he wants. Juanas answered sympathetically, the strange thing is that he is not open to such temptations, yet he will cure you if you meet him without charge, merely on sensing that you love him. So this, I think, is almost like Zabalawi seems like Jesus here for a minute, right? Because that's like the Christian idea of salvation is all you have to do is put your trust, your faith, and your love in Jesus, and he'll save you. That's where you'll find your rest from your anxiety. And so Jesus doesn't want money, just like Zabalawi doesn't want money. And so like this is the idea that the guy is missing the point. Zabalawi is not a person, not a doctor who's going to remove a tumor. It's a state of being where you are at peace with yourself and the world around you. And so, that's what we get through the line, merely on sensing that you love it. That reveals the allegory. So here's my thesis for the story. Matthews combines realism and mysticism to illustrate the greatest problem plaguing the modern human person, inability to find rest in a world of suffering. So, I think we're living as I've said all throughout these last two lectures, in the most extraordinary time and perhaps most challenging or difficult time in human history. So it's going to be the hardest time to find rest and peace. But I think what Matthews is telling us here is we have to. I mean, what's the last line of the story? Yes, I have to find Zabalawi. So the story ends, the narrator still searching. That makes it a tragedy. We don't want to emulate the tragic heroes. That's not a point of of a tragedy. We probably want to emulate Captain America, but he's not a tragic hero. Hamlet's a tragic hero. Oedipus is a tragic hero. We don't want to emulate Hamlet or Oedipus, just like we don't want to emulate the narrator here. But why do we read tragedy? That recognition, what the hero learns at the end of the story. Here, the narrator hasn't learned anything. He's been told the suffering is part of the cure. He's seen what it's like to be at rest in a dream, but he doesn't find the cure. He's still searching. His last line is, I have to keep searching. So he doesn't have the recognition the tragic hero usually does, but the reader, the reader, can have that recognition. We can say, I have to stop searching. I have to be at rest. And so, what gives us that rest, I think, is the question Matthews doesn't answer. And that might be different for each of us. But part of the answer is that suffering is the cure. I think it isn't the cure, but it's part of it, excuse me. So I think part of the answer is that we have to accept that suffering is inevitable. And then we have to learn how to walk forward bearing that realization. And we have to find rest.